cost of freedom, like many have been referring to that war, had a high number of casualties for both sides. Entire countries had collapsed. In an ideal world, I would say that no one won the war. Poverty, ecological disasters, disease, and exile was a common sight during the 30s. The advanced world had to face the new order followed in the wake of the war. Since United Judea was established, right after the war, it pressured the UN into recognizing and enforcing the Fifth Amendment to the Law of Return, one of the most controversial laws to be brought before the UN. Passing the law would lead to a radical result: the deportation and exile of millions from their homes. Year after year, the UN opposed on passing the law, claiming it violated human rights. Surprisingly, 14 years after the end of the war, the United Nations votes in favour. The law, and all of its enforcing methods, was passed. All Jewish people in the world must arrive to United Judea by the end of the year 2048. Next year.
I need to leave Germany on the 3rd of May in 2048. Less than a year. The thought of leaving all the people I know and love bothers me. From the moment the agent gave this to me. I was sitting in my study here at home when I heard a knock on the door. I opened it and he stood there. He asked me if my name is Grace, and when I confirmed, he gave this to me and said, "Next year in Jerusalem," and just left.
Well, I was born in 2017, and I left Israel when I was 4 years old with my parents in 2021. So I haven't been there for 25 years. On the other hand, I'm curious to see how the place has changed, although I barely remember anything from there. The city I grew up in was a port city called Ashdod. We lived very close to the water. My only memory from there is going down every Saturday with my mother and playing in the sand.
I was working at my bar as usual as this guy came in. At first I thought he wanted to order a shot. He asked me if I'm John. I confirmed I was. And then he handed to me this. "Next year in Jerusalem," he said. And then he just left.
My father, his name is Dor, was born in a place called Kadesh Barnea in 1987. When he was 27 years old, he moved to Germany. I think he got here for several reasons. Look, my father is an artist, and in those years, Berlin was the greatest cultural center in Europe, just like Sarajevo is today. If you were a filmmaker, a musician, or even a designer, and you wanted to be heard or exposed, you probably had to come over to Berlin.
My mother is from Ukraine, and she came to Israel in 1991 after the collapse of the USSR. They met during a protest known as the cheese protest. Called this because of the high price of cheese, but actually the protests were about high living costs generally. And my father was there cooking for people, cooking for the protesters on the site. And my mother was there because, like many Israelis, she'd moved out of her apartment and was living in tents.
My father told me once about a time where many young people had to leave their homes and reside themselves in tents on the street because of how bad the economy was. And that's basically what he did. He just sat by his tent in the middle of the street and played the guitar all day.
If you are rich, you live in one of the central cities, Tel Aviv, Herzliya, or the surroundings, and you'd probably have no idea about things happening right under your nose. If you were poor, like 80% of the Israel population back then, well, you probably had no time to think about political morality or anything like that. And after countless demonstrations and protests about the same things that people had been arguing about for the last 11 years, the government decides to take a less lenient approach to the people. On the 5th of August 2021, where 32 protesters got killed, my parents decided to move out from Israel and came here. We left Israel just before the 4th Palestinian Intifada began.
Music is values, and art represents values. If you are making music that's supposed to represent your values, while the place you are living represents the exact opposite of those values, it makes the whole process almost impossible. You don't have any chance, especially when you are living on the line. Daddy made rock music, guitars, distortion, and in English. And you know, rock music always had a rebellious spirit in it, a spirit of criticism. So of course it didn't go well with the regime, the same regime that ruled over the radio station at that time. When he was in Israel, I think it was impossible for him to make it in the music business. Playing a music genre that wasn't national music. The popular music in Israel at that time was a combination of old dance music with some elements of Middle Eastern music. Well, no wonder that none of Dad's friends could stand it. Yeah, Dad was naive. He just felt that he didn't fit in with the local art and the culture. You take a person that grew on this kind of music. Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Eminem, those kinds of bands where the blood in his veins. And then you take him and make him live in a place where the music doesn't speak to him, has nothing to do with